Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Cosmic Echo, a Tail Leaders podcast. I'm Matt. He's Lee.
Hey, everyone.
And today we're interviewing Kenn, a very interesting person. Some of the topics we covered are post-tribal shamanism and what exactly that means. We covered Kenn and his work. And we also had interesting conversations about the nature of the soul and how understanding and perception of the soul helps you in daily life. And without further ado, let's get right into the interview. Today, we're going to be interviewing Kenn. He's a shaman, a healer, writer, a man of many talents. He's here with us right now. How about you introduce yourself?
Okay, well, thanks. And it's always interesting when someone asks you to introduce yourself.
Yeah.
A lot of it depends on what part of the country I'm in. You know, in Cincinnati, where you don't have a whole lot of shamans, I still get a kick out of the fact that I make a living as a professional shaman. The same place that had, what's his name? The guy who shut down Hustler, and it's a very conservative place, and yet it's got some really interesting nooks and crannies.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's where I work. And, you know, the thing is, there are people everywhere who need this kind of work simply because it's a part of the human condition. We all have these deeper parts of the self that in shamanic parlance we talk about as soul, but it doesn't really matter what you call them. That's just a different map for the same territory. But I've been doing this professionally full-time since about 1989, and I work here in Cincinnati. We have my wife and I have a practice called Body and Soul over on the east side of town. We live with our daughter over on the west side of town, so we have a nice commute down along the river every day.
Nice.
So that's a big part of it. Now, a lot of the work I do is with one-on-one with clients, either in person or remotely via Skype or Zoom or FaceTime or whatever platform they want to work with. And I'm always amazed at how well it works, because I have to say, I'm still a skeptic. I've been doing this professionally for over 30 years. I'm still a skeptic. I'm always looking at why and how, and isn't it amazing that stuff actually works?
Yeah, exactly.
But every day it proves itself to me. So I've written a couple books on it, got a couple more coming, and I'd say a lot of what I do right now is passing on the teachings that I've received to other people that want to put them to use in their lives through workshops. I have a series that's going on here in Cincinnati right now. I've got another series that's getting ready to start up in the Detroit area, Dearborn Heights, in September. I just finished teaching in Syracuse, New York. You know, over the years, I've taught in Chicago, a lot in Detroit, various and sundry other places, including across the ocean, over in London, in Germany. No. So, yeah, it's a good life.
Yeah.
I haven't been bored in many, many years.
Yeah, it definitely sounds great.
Travel a lot.
I don't travel as much as I used to before my wife and I have had our daughter. She's just turned 9 years old, and my wife made it very clear to me that it was very important that I'm around more than I had been. And I'm slow, but I get it.
Yeah.
So I just about cut the travel in half for a few years there, and I'm just beginning to get back to that a bit. So here I am, here you are. What are we going to talk about?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been interested in shamanistic traditions for a long period of time. So I'm really interested in how you got involved in it, and then what you kind of what traditions you learned from in order to get a grasp on how to actually perform traditional healing experiences, things like that.
Okay. So I got into it in the most traditional way possible, which is I was chosen by a spirit and got my ass kicked, you know?
Yeah.
So I went through all kinds of trauma during my childhood and early adulthood, to the point that I was just so blown open that I started paying attention to those entities that were showing up and realizing that they weren't just in my head, and went to a lot of therapy to make sure that I wasn't just kidding myself,
Yeah.
and worked with a number of healers in different traditions. I worked with people from the Dagara tradition in Burkina Faso, which isn't strictly speaking a shamanic tradition, but it's in there. Worked most deeply with a shofet of the Amharic tradition from the Middle East, from Israel. And that's essentially a shamanic practitioner in that tradition. And she's been my mentor for at least 30 years.
Wow.
So she's been amazingly helpful, really kept my nose to the grindstone and my feet to the straight and narrow. But the actual teachings that I pass on, I mean, I've studied with Tibetan teachers, with Indian teachers, with Native American, with people who do save, which is a Norse practice. So a lot of Reconstructionists and a lot of traditionals. But the teachings I pass on come from my own spirit ally. And I just call him grandfather.
Okay.
Anytime I've tried to come up with anything more complex than that, he's just laughed at me. So that's what he
Interesting.
did.
Nice.
So I do want to say a few things about what shamanism is.
Yeah, definitely.
Because there's a lot of confusion about it.
Oh yeah.
And it's pretty simple. Anywhere you go, anywhere in the world where they have a shamanic practice, you have someone who is chosen by the spirits, who goes into an altered state, a trance state, intentionally, in order to enter into the spirit realms. And then either they journey to the spirits, or they call the spirits to them in order to bring about changes, healing, that sort of thing, or to bring back information as through divination, and always in service to others. Okay. Now, this same definition of what shamanism is just as valid for somebody working in our culture as it is for somebody working in an Aboriginal culture, in a traditional tribal culture. Does that begin to answer that question?
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely, yeah, that was a good answer.
I mean,
go ahead, Matt.
yeah, like I was gonna point it out. Like if I were to go out into the street and ask somebody what they thought a shaman was, it would almost ubiquitously get something like, oh, a shaman is it's like something to do with Native Americans, right? Or like some, the Amazon rainforest or something like that.
Right, and yet most Native American cultures are not even shamanic. They're animistic. And animism is simply the belief that everything and everyone, even the styrofoam coffee cup you're drinking out of, is divine, is alive, has spirit, right? But that's not shamanism. It's where shamanism arises from, but in and of itself, it's animism. And most Native American cultures are animistic, not shamanic.
Yeah, that
makes sense.
That's definitely a delineation I'd agree with my just tangential studies on it or experiences with it. But that's great. Like that you can have like a very succinct, compact definition of what a shaman is to bring to people, and they don't look at you sideways.
Right. It's taken more than a few years to put that together. And I'm constantly learning too, because there's always something more. I mean, I've been doing this for over 30 years and I'm still just scratching the surface. Now, the techniques that I've learned and pass on are all ones that I've tested for years before I started teaching them. And I know they work. They don't necessarily work for everyone, but for those they work for, they work.
Huh, interesting.
But those techniques are still just maps. You know, there's this thing they used to say back in the 60s, don't confuse the map for the territory.
Yeah.
And this is very much that kind of situation where we talk about there being three worlds, there being a world tree that connects the three worlds. We talk about the different parts of the soul. And these are very valid in the sense that they help us to get a direct experience of what is there. And that's the most important element. But a map is only as good as it is effective in showing you the territory. So what I try to do is be very pragmatic, very down to earth, and only work with those things that help people find that territory, experience it directly.
I see.
That makes sense. I guess something that you brought up at the beginning was this calling to be a shaman, and that's something that I've heard a lot for a lot of people that are interested in shamanism. They're always interested to know what the calling is so they can make sure to answer it, But I want to hear what your calling was. It sounds like it was a little bit more clearly defined.
Well, the human experience is pretty messy. And it's only when we back up enough and start drawing those maps we're just talking about that it seems anything but messy. In experience, in direct experience, those calls of spirit are often like getting run over by a Mack truck. And there's nobody there, there's no context in our culture to say, hey, you're being called by a spirit to be a shaman. Congratulations. It's not there. So I had, by the time I was 14 years old, I'd lost my older brother, my mother, my father, had various and sundry other things happen. And it wasn't until I was in my late teens that I started realizing that there was something else going on here. And then I made the mistake of reading Carlos Castaneda, which is also not shamanism.
Right. What is your side tangent? What is your view of his work, I guess?
Well, it's how can I put this? He stole from some very interesting sources.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And that's been documented. I'm not saying anything that isn't out there in the public domain. He seems like he was a very interesting character, but his views on this whole man of power thing, and sorcery, and walking with death, most of that has nothing to do with the practice of shamanism in any culture. Personally, I have an issue with people who claim that they are doing something. They claim that they've had certain experiences and they base their teachings on those experiences, and they're just not valid.
Okay, yeah.
And he may have had a call of spirit, but he didn't go and meet with this Don Juan character.
Right.
And he didn't have these other, and the Yaqui Indians have nothing to do with him. So at best, it is pretty trippy fiction.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people follow his work, so it's interesting to hear somebody kind of put it, to rest that a lot of his information is not supported by traditional shamanistic practices.
Right. Well, there's this New Age adage that all paths lead up the mountain.
Right, yeah.
And if that were true, we'd have a lot of people up at the top of the mountain.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, not all paths do lead all the way up. Some do, many do, and some go about halfway up and then they start circling. And some just circle around there at the bottom and then go off, find a good mall and do some shopping.
Yeah.
They're not going to get you where you need to go.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, one thing that you were talking about that I'm really interested in is getting into some of the practices that you actually perform. I mean, you talk about learning from all these different cultures and these tools that you have. So I want to, I'm interested in hearing some real experiences that you've had or you've helped other people, things like that. We can share.
Sure. Well, one particular technique that I received from grandfather, and then I've seen it in the practice of the Gado Indians down in Peru. I've seen it in Tibetan shamanism, Lun shamanism, and I've seen it in tantric practice as well. And I'm sure it's elsewhere. Excuse me. And that's what we call medicine body.
Okay.
A medicine body is, I was going to say simply, but there's no simple about it, really. I have to explain a little bit about the way that our bodies take in and process energy.
Okay.
Okay.
And we have three, what the Chinese call the three burners. Okay. So you have one down below the navel, one in the middle of the chest, and one up here.
Okay.
And what happens is with the air we breathe and the food that we eat, we gather chi, energy, undifferentiated energy, into that lower burner below the navel. And when that comes in there, just as when you take a bite of food and swallow it, it goes into your stomach, it begins to digest. And in a similar way, a very natural organic process happens by which that undifferentiated chi comes into the lower burner and is digested into the kind of chi that your body uses to make blood and lymph and bone and sinew and muscle and everything else. All right? Because you have to understand that just as physics has pointed out in the last few decades, everything is made of energy.
Right. Yeah.
And chi is that energy. When we take in the chi into the lower burner, it gets digested. When the body feels like it has enough of that kind of chi, it brings some up to the middle burner where it's further digested into the kind of chi that we think with and feel with and experience with. And literally, it's the kind of chi that tells all the other chi where to go and what to do. All right? It's very directive.
So you're kind of controlled by the second one, I guess. That's what you're kind of saying. Like, not controlled, but
well,
it's the control center.
It's actually how you support your consciousness within your body.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
So then finally, when you have surfeit of that, the rest comes up to the upper burner where it's further digested and then comes out through here and through the crown and fills the area around you with what the Chinese call Wei Qi. And Wei Qi is your aura, your electromagnetic field that naturally radiates from your body. But it's also, by Chinese medical terms, it's the immune system. It's what stops external pathogens from getting inside. Okay. So what we do with medicine body is we build up that Jing Shen, that kind of energy that goes out and connects in with the world around us, the spirit world. And we build up enough of that so that our consciousness can expand, literally, beyond the confines of our physical bodies, out into the space around us. Okay. Now, this is expansive not only on an energetic and physical level, but as you can imagine, for the ego, that is used to thinking of itself as that which happens in here, right? Maybe a little bit here. But when suddenly the ego is experiencing self as filling this whole space around you, this begins to break down a lot of the old constructs around identity. So it's also very expansive of consciousness in that sense.
Okay, yeah.
Now, as I said, I've run into this same technique by other names in other cultures. And it's one of the ways I began to think, okay, grandfather must have something going on. It must be something besides a psychological allegory, because obviously other human beings have been doing this for a while in other parts of the world. You know, his explanation of the soul I've seen show up in other cultures. You know, the maps are a little bit specific, a little bit different one place to another, but the basics are all there. So with medicine body, what you find is that when you've expanded your consciousness out here and you surround not only your body, but if you're sitting with somebody else, you've become very aware of who they are, not just as a physical form within you, but energetically, at a soul level. You begin to realize their ancestors, where their soul has come from, where it's going. And all these things just arise naturally as an organic part of this process, just by observing from this other mode of being. And, you know, that's probably the most important thing I can pass on in some setting like this, is that we're not talking about just a made up or imagined capacity.
Right.
These are parts of the human experience that have been around for as long as there have been human beings. I'll talk later about soul awareness, for instance. And soul awareness is pretty much identical to what the Buddhists call non-dual awareness. Human beings have not only been experiencing this, but we've been writing about it at least 6,000 years. If you go back and read the Upanishads, okay, these Vedic texts from 6,000 years ago, they're talking about that same thing. And when you experience it, you can look at those texts and go, why, yes, that's the same experience that I have had.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it?
6,000 years later. It's fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the things I've noticed, and like just you know, looking up things in the internet after you've had, you know, a hypnagogic or, you know, altered mind state experience, is that there's parallels in almost every culture about what's happening. And, you know, that like a good example is like the Christian Dark Night of the Soul and the, you know, Vedic Tantric Kundalini Awakening. And then there's other parallels in other cultures as well.
Right.
And
exactly, Matt.
It's interesting to see how ancient all of this knowledge is, and how we even as people in the modern age, we have words to describe stuff like that, like intuition. Like, this person's very intuitive. He could just, you know, he has a gut feeling about you. You know, all these things that belie these kinds of experiences that have been around forever. We have normalized into stuff that's like, oh, okay, but we've separated the context from it. So
exactly, Matt. Yes.
So when you perform like healing practices with other people, like your clients, you talked about opening the body up, you know, the healing body, or the medicine body, I guess you called it, right? Is that correct?
Yes, medicine body.
Yeah, medicine body. So you open that up, and then of the person and also yourself, I guess, to in a way interact.
Well, no, I don't open theirs up because it takes a lot of chi cultivation to get to the point where you can move your consciousness out like that. I will teach my students how to do that. In fact, our second workshop in the series of 9 workshops is focused on medicine body. And the first part of it is all about cultivating enough chi, you know, enough Jing Shen, so that you can be out here and maintain your awareness. Now, I don't know how much you'll be able to perceive from where you're at, but I'm just going to demonstrate real quickly. Okay, so I reach inward, grab a hold of that around my inner body, and bring it out like so. Okay. And now my awareness is very altered. I'm immediately in a trance state. And I'm having to kind of like pat my head and rub my stomach at the same time.
Okay.
I'm out here kind of smiling and floating and feeling luminous and not really thinking, but simply perceiving and feeling the land spirit, hooking into the land spirit, feeling present with that. But I'm also trying to be able to relate through my body, through my ego to you guys.
Yeah.
So that's what I'll do with a client.
Okay.
So kind of reach out and contain them at that. And that immediately begins to have a soothing, calming effect with a person. Okay. And then when you bring the land spirit under them and give them that support, that helps as well. So yeah, this is how I work most of my clients.
Okay.
Well, I was just thinking that one thing that would really help is if I give a few pieces of background with this.
Oh yeah, yeah, sure.
A few pieces of context. One is that grandfather, my spirit ally, has been very clear that the teachings he's passing on through me and to me are to be used in our Western culture. So this is a form of post-tribal shamanism. That's what I mean by post-tribal shamanism, is that it's not arising from a culture whose primary unit of identity is the communal one. Now, that said, it's very important to point out that the nature of human experience is such that we have more than one piece to our soul. And one of those pieces is what grandfather calls ancestral soul. And the primary characteristic of that is that it's communal. All right. So when you look, if you imagine your parents standing behind you and their parents behind them and their parents behind them, all of those relatives together, all of your blood relations together, one big ancestor soup, that is your ancestral soul.
Oh, okay.
And that is with you with every breath you take. Now, what this does is that every time we come together with somebody and we feel any kind of connection, or we begin working with them, or we have some kind of project that we do together, or we go out on a date, or we get together and start playing music together, anything where we feel engaged with them, we begin to hook up and form these communal constructs. You can call them souls, you can call them gestalts, whatever. But it's a natural human proclivity. We all do it. And not understanding that really gets in the way of us being able to function at our best in this world and in community. Okay, so that's something I wanted to put out there.
Yeah, definitely. Is that kind of your I noticed on your website you had like 3-day courses kind of that you teach. Is that part of that those courses, I guess?
Right. Yeah, there's a series of 9 Kenn courses. And it takes a little bit over 2 years to do the whole series.
Oh, okay.
And that's certainly a part of the primary teachings.
Okay. Interesting.
I do want to point out, though, that the people who take the workshops are, for the most part, not called shamanism themselves.
Oh, okay. So they're just trying to learn about it?
Right. Well, they're using the teachings to enrich their lives, to connect more with the earth, with their ancestors, with their own soul. So these can be very enriching experiences, practices. You don't have to become a shaman just to do these practices.
That makes sense. Yeah, so it's open to everyone. I mean, those are great tools to know about. It sounds like. I mean, one thing I noticed that you help a lot of people with is chronic pain. I was in the military and I have chronic pain now, so it'd be interesting to hear about how you use your energy body to assist other people on with that stuff. If that's involved, I don't know.
Well, that's another, there are certain kinds of shamanic illnesses, okay? And by this, I mean the kind of illnesses that the shaman can treat using shamanic technique. And one of the biggest is something that we refer to as soul loss, because that's the lack of terminology we have. It's not really the soul that's being lost. We have that Jing Shen that we was talking about, the ancestral chi that holds all of our pieces together. Okay, it's the matrix that holds the different parts of the soul and the body and the mind all together. When we experience trauma, it can be physical trauma, emotional trauma, psychological, energetic, whatever, we have a natural response to ablate part of that substance to carry away some of the intensity of that experience. Then what happens is we go off to a hospital or wherever, and that ablated substance stays there. Now, keep in mind that for 70, 80,000 years, human beings haven't moved very far. I mean, you could be born, live, and die all within a couple-mile area.
Yeah.
And it's that same area where the bones of your ancestors are buried for dozens of generations. So when you're living in a situation like that and you get attacked by an animal and you have a traumatic experience, you survive it, well, you're going to circle back around to that same space and you're going to take that back. Right? But if you're visiting another city or you're at school and you have something happen to you, you don't necessarily go back to that same place. And so eventually what happens is we lose so much of that energetic matrix that we begin to experience everything from fibromyalgia, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, essentially a sense of lost substance.
Yeah.
Right?
I can relate.
And, yeah, right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
and what's
some of us move, some of us move like 7 times in a year in the military. So eventually,
right.
you just do this feeling of like a loss of something. Something's missing,
Right.
So chronic pain is probably very common in the military possibly because of that.
It is. Yes. And also because of trauma.
Right. Yeah. Trauma doesn't help either.
Yes. So the way that I deal with that with clients is, well, first of all, the way a traditional shaman usually deals with it is they will go and journey into the spirit realm, go to the place where that lost substance is, retrieve it, bring it back, and put it back into the person's body. Because one of the most important elements of our culture is the sovereignty of the individual. For me to do that for my client is actually disempowering. All right. So instead, I help them move into the spirit realms with me. We go into shamanic body, and then we journey together. We go back to those places, and they receive that directly. Then we go back to lodge, go back to the world tree, and they reintegrate that. They digest that energy and make it them again.
In one of your videos, you were talking about the importance of when you open somebody up, or you're opening to something like this, then you sounded like grounding yourself in a way.
Right. Well, when you open that medicine body, especially with a student that I've taught how to do that, it's really important to put it away again. Otherwise, you're in this expanded, altered state. And usually what happens is you begin to experience things through your physical senses, and that brings you back into your body. But good energetic hygiene. I'm doing it right now. I need to put this away. Okay, so it's just that, instead of leaving them wide open, you want to make sure you bring them back, get them grounded, have them focused in their physical senses, in their body, in their mind, so that they can function. That's kind of important.
So somebody that has, say, spontaneous kind of projections, like where you would exit, what would be a tool that somebody could use to kind of center themselves in their body, just like you did? I mean, I was interested in what you just did.
Okay, so someone who is naturally dissociative, is that what you're thinking of?
Right, like somebody, say
Like-
somebody does what you do on accident. They're not trained.
Like
Right.
me, for instance.
I don't know what you did, but it seemed like you were doing something.
Right. Well, first thing I would do is show them that they can do this at will. And when you can do it at will, then you can also choose not to do it. Okay, so, I mean, I was naturally dissociative too. And I don't go out of my body unless I want to. So I know it can be done.
Okay.
And it's
Was it
really
scary
just a
at
matter
first
of learning.
Was it scary when it first started happening to you? I mean,
There was so much else that was so much scarier.
oh yeah.
Just leaving my body was no big deal.
Oh, okay.
It's all context.
Yeah.
Relative to the other stuff that was going on, no big deal. But it can be. It can be really frightening. It can be terrifying to the ego until the ego realizes that you're not dying, that it's not being destroyed, that it still has a job, and that it simply isn't the boss that it thought it was.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a great a great idea, because like I've had naturally dissociative things. Whenever I try to induce that from like meditation again, it's very hard to lose that control. And I can sense very clearly that the problem is me having this mindset of I want to experience a certain way. I have all these senses that I'm used to, and it's essentially the ego being like, nah, this is going to go my way. And that's
Right.
been the intuitive understanding of my situation, which works for me now, because I'm a software developer. It's not necessarily conducive to my work environment to just be projecting while I'm sitting there typing on a keyboard. It's very distracting. So it's
right.
Yeah.
So, Ken, you were getting into how to bring it back, and I kind of cut you off there. So, like, what is this technique, I guess, that might be able to help somebody like Matt out?
Okay, so one thing is I'm very particular about how I leave.
Okay.
All right. And the way I do that is I go through the doorway at my heart center, and I go from the outer world through that doorway and into my spiritual body, which is through that doorway. It's like almost like through a mirror. Once I'm there, I'm very clear. It's okay, for right now, I'm just going to bring my attention to that doorway and move through. Okay, now in spiritual body, I can move around here. I can become very diffuse, whatever. If I want to come back, I literally bring myself together, come back through that doorway, and out into physical body, and I feel myself filling my physical body. So now I'm contained within my physical body. That means I'm also contained by my physical senses, by my physical brain, and by this experience. And that is the essence of grounding. To be grounded into this experience as a human being.
Interesting, yeah. So you just kind of brought yourself back into your body, and then it kind of reattached itself. I guess that's the best way it sounds.
Right.
Okay. Cool. That was pretty cool to see. happen. Thanks for sharing with that experience.
My pleasure. It's kind of what I do 24/7. So
Yeah, probably pretty used to it. One thing I noticed on your website, you were talking about shadow work. So like, I'm really interested in Jungian shadow type of archetype work, and you go into a little bit of that. And I wanted to see what your view of shadow work was, and how you work with your clients, and in working through that.
well, it is very similar to the Jungian perspective on shadows, in that by the time I work with a client or a student on their shadows, we've done a whole lot of other work. And we've already integrated everything that is accessible within their conscious self. So what remains is their unconscious. And specifically, I mean, when we're talking about shadows, we're talking about parts of the self that we have disidentified with. We've said, this is not me. And usually this occurs in childhood, early childhood, where, for instance, we really want our parents' attention. We go running into the kitchen when mom is cooking something on the stove, looking for attention, and we get yelled at. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, okay, so I do not need attention because that didn't feel good, right? And you start creating a shadow in the sense that you are taking that part of yourself that is completely valid and healthy, but because of circumstances, you get a bad message and you start shutting that down.
Okay.
What happens with the shadow is that it has enough critical mass that it continues to function unconsciously within you. And because of that, it can have an impact on your actions, your choices, your views. And so otherwise, we could just let them stay out there. You know, if they didn't have a negative impact on how we experience our lives, it wouldn't be an issue.
Right.
Because, you know, ultimately, shamanism is about living life well. It's very practical. If it doesn't help you be a happier, healthier, more whole and complete person, then why would you do it?
That's a good question.
Yeah. So we're looking at these shadows because they may keep you from being able to have a good relationship. They may keep you from being able to hold on to money. It may keep you from being able to function well in your job, in your career. So you don't want those things in the way. And so we identify them, and then we learn how to bring them out to where they can begin to communicate at a conscious level, and then gradually bring them back into the whole. We reintegrate.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that from what I've read from Jungian shadow work, it sounds very very close to that type of work. So I can kind of relate in those experiences with through my own personal shadow work. So great information in that area. With your books, I'm really interested in talking about those to make sure our listeners get an idea of like your actual work that you've done that people can read about. So you wrote 2 different books, is that correct? Post-Tribal Shamanism and Dances of the Stones. So can you go a little bit on that?
Sure. Back in 1989, I took a road trip with a friend from Germany. I like where this story is going. The Catskills. And at the time, I was really trying to come up with a way to write a book on this, and it wasn't just another book on shamanism. It wasn't going to be a textbook. It wasn't going to be like Michael Harner's Way of the Shaman. I wanted something different. So I go over there. Her dad loans us his big red Mercedes station wagon, which if you've ever been over to Europe, you know that most cars are about yay big.
Yeah.
Right? This was huge. So we're driving around Europe, through Germany, Belgium, France, down the coast of France. And at this one point, we pull over at a little market. We go in to get some food, some water, and my friend picks up this book on the myth of YS, and we start noticing all these synchronicities, all these parallels between the book that she's reading and the landscape we're going through. And at some point, at the same time, mind you, she is picking my brain about shamanism. So we're having all these great conversations. And about 3 days into the trip, I realized I should really start taking better notes, because this would make a good book. And I had no idea, because those synchronicities took us on quite a journey. And we wound up taking the ferry from Roscoff to Plymouth in the UK, and then driving down into Cornwall to Land's End, all this. And so the whole story is about that journey and about our conversations about shamanism. And then at the end of each chapter, there's something I call deepening, where I take you through an exercise or an experience that deepens the understanding of what we were talking about in that chapter. So that came out in 2008.
Is that the post-tribal shamanism book that you're talking about right now, or
that's
Dances of Stones? Okay.
This is Dance of Stones. Dance of Stones is some kind of
I noticed the drawing
ritual.
was the image on there is definitely more European looking than the other one, so I had figured just from the cover.
Well, and then about 10 years after that, I got around to finally writing the book that I had avoided writing by writing the first book. And that is Post-Tribal Shamanism, A New Look at the Old Ways. And that is essentially a textbook for the series that I teach.
Can you tell us a little bit about what tribal shamanism is?
Well, in a tribal context, now I grew up out in Arizona, and my dad was a traveling salesman. And among other places, he would go and sell things to the trading posts on Navajo land. So I have these vague memories of being 12, 13 years old and having to go with him on these trips and being bored silly. I'd have to bring a book along. But he would introduce me to these Navajo Dine elders. And then afterwards, when we'd leave, he'd say, "Now, did you notice when Sam Hosting introduced himself, he didn't use his name, he said Water Clan." Like, yeah, Dad, I got that. So why do you think that is? I don't know. I was just bored. But of course, the reason is that he identifies with that communal entity of his clan more so than with Sam. Okay, so that's really the defining characteristic of a true tribal culture, is that tribal identity is more important and more immediately valuable even to the individual than the individual himself. And we don't live there. That is not where we're coming from. And so it's difficult for us to even really understand where people are coming from a tribal context. All right. And so there are a number of ways in which the tribal, traditional shamanic practices need to be tweaked a little bit for people in our culture. Now, there are basically 3 different kinds of shamanism, valid, effective shamanism in this case. There is indigenous shamanism that is practiced in these tribal cultures around the world. There is reconstructive shamanism, like core shamanism, where they have the idea of how shaman is supposed to work, and they go back and try to reconstruct something. And then there is what I call post-tribal shamanism, where you have someone who is directly learning through and from the spirits and still in this post-tribal culture. So it's the same way that we would have learned if we had been in a tribal culture, but the teachings are a little bit different because we're not.
That makes sense. Yeah. So you kind of modified the traditions, I guess, a little bit so that they work for modern day.
Well, grandfather
America, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, because I thought it would be a lot easier to just go ahead and follow some of the tribal teachings. It's very attracted to Tibetan shamanism. And with each case, when I get a little bit too far into it, I have grandfather here going, whoa, far enough. You have your own teachings. You need to pay attention to this. You get too far down that road, you're going to lose your connections here. So, for instance, I've done a lot of sweat lodges, but grandfather doesn't let me go into a sweat lodge anymore.
Really?
Not in the movie. Yeah. The last time I tried was maybe 3 years ago.
Interesting. Do you feel like there's a reason behind that? Or, I mean, obviously there's a reason, but do you maybe know the reason?
The reason is simply that if I were to go any further into that, it's something that one of my martial arts teachers told me many, many years ago, is the hunter that goes after 2 rabbits at the same time doesn't catch either one.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And so it's one thing to learn from other cultures and to apply that knowledge to how I received my teachings from grandfather. It's another thing to leave my own heritage behind and get adopted into a different tribe and go forward there. That is not my calling. And so that disrespects grandfather and the work that I'm supposed to be doing.
Makes sense.
And he's been, here's one story that pretty much illustrates the whole practice, is that I really thought that a good way for me to go forward would be to go get certified as a psychotherapist.
Yeah.
So I tried to do this, and grandfather said, nope, it's not what you're supposed to be doing. I tried someplace else, and nope, still not. I finally thought, well, I'm going to be really clever. I'm going to put together my own program. I'm going to go to Antioch up in Yellow Springs in Ohio and design my own program. And I'll even use this program to write my thesis, and that'll be my book. So I'm going to kill multiple birds with one stone.
Yeah. So
I just flew in. I've been teaching in Boston. I flew into the airport, got in my 91 Nissan Maxima. I love the car. And I took off for Yellow Springs. And I'm going, it's a beautiful sunny day, not a cloud in the sky. I'm zipping along the highway. I pass this semi, and all of a sudden, there's a big puddle out of nowhere. And all of a sudden, I've just done a 180. Suddenly, I'm going backwards down the highway at like 70 miles an hour. And all I could do was go, okay, I'm going to steer into the divider instead of the red pickup truck. And the whole world kind of went up, came back down again. Windshield shattered, cars totaled. CD's still playing. I got out of the car, walked away. The only injury I had was a little scratch from flying glass.
Oh.
Right there.
That's not bad.
Subtle, but I got the point.
That's a pretty clear message.
I get it. Yeah, and that's the sort of thing where, spirit will start off just knocking gently, but if you don't listen, it uses a larger and larger stick until you listen.
Okay.
So, as I say, I'm kind of slow, but I get there.
Yeah, I'm a little slow too.
So
you got some questions?
Yeah, I've been listening to the stories, and I see that a lot of the signposts and a lot of the communication going on it seems to be involving the synchronicities that you were talking about. These how a lot of people view synchronicities as like signposts, and like this is the way to be going, or this is the way not to be going, and that's what a lot of those people, you know, culturally call signs. Like, so I was going to think about what your conceptualization of synchronicities and signs and communicating with how you were communicated with.
Well,
what's that like?
I want to go take that a little bit further and use the word omen.
Oh, omen. That's another one.
Right? So a lot of people have this misconception that an omen is something that's happening out there in the world that has the same meaning no matter who sees it. And that's not the case. What's happening is that the shaman goes into a state of receptivity, of a trance, okay? And they go out and they're looking for a sign, for an omen. And in that state, whatever they see around them is going to give them the information that they need to receive. And it may not be what you're going to find in some dictionary of animal meanings, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But it gets the message across to the shaman.
I see.
Does that make sense?
Yep. I get it. I immediately thought of, you know, like casting out bones and tarot cards and looking at astrology, like all those things, like the movement of the stars and stuff.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, the shaman just looks at things in a different way. Take astrology,
mm-hmm.
okay? The popular view of astrology, whether people believe it or not, is that the stars and the positions of the different stars and planets have an impact on us and can cause changes, right?
Mm-hmm.
The shamanic perspective is what we would say is a non-causal, relational perspective, which is there are all these patterns that are constantly going on in our lives, in the world, in the larger universe. And it's a lot easier to see those patterns in the movements of the stars and planets than it is down here where things are all messy and up close. And because of the synchronicity, because of the connectedness of these patterns, we know that when that pattern up there is going like that, that at the same time there's a similar pattern going on down here. So when Mercury goes retrograde, that is not sending a beam of energy down here and screwing up our communications.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's simply saying, oh, this is the pattern that's going on right now. See, this is the big sign that says this is the pattern that's going on right now down here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I get it.
Yeah, you were talking about having different a different perspective of the view of astrology, but I want to get your opinion on the soul. I know you were particularly interested in talking about that.
Well, grandfather says we have many pieces to the soul, okay, but he mainly focuses on the ancestral soul that we talked about before, that has a communal aspect and then also has individuals showing up within that, usually 4, 5, 6, sometimes as many as 7 generations going back, where you'll still be able to see those individuals within your communal soul. And then the other main piece is the celestial soul. And the celestial soul is the part of us that has had other lifetimes before this and will go on to have other lifetimes after this. So the way grandfather tells it, when we are conceived, sometime after conception, the ancestral soul comes into the fetus and can kind of come in and out during gestation, the whole time the child's in the womb. When the child is born, with that first breath that they take outside the mother's body, that celestial soul comes in. So that's where you have the celestial soul and the ancestral soul joining together, and they begin to create the new individual that will be your ego, your identity, and so on.
Yeah, I know that you said the first breath. I've heard that before from other traditions as well. I've heard that a few times. It's recently, oddly enough, that a lot of people believe that the first breath of a human being is actually when the soul kind of attaches to the body.
Yeah, and it really helps to understand that there's more than one piece to that.
Yeah, definitely.
I've heard people argue. I've heard this argument go on and say, well, some people say the soul comes in at conception. Other people say, no, it doesn't come in until birth. You're both right.
Got it. There's parts to it.
Sounds like they're around each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it belies the concept of astrology, where your natal chart is the moment you are born, as essentially your first breath, right. and you're more accurate based on the time, the place, that long of taking your first breath. So you can the idea is the pattern in the star at that moment has an indication of what probably your celestial soul is like.
Yeah, it's getting a little later. I mean, we've covered a lot. There's definitely a lot in here from your practice with shamanism, how you actually learn to use techniques, and then you were talking about the soul, and I know that you were talking about working with companies and stuff like that to do some soul type of work. I'm interested. Is that like a kind of in a way saying that culture has a soul, and a community, a business, things like that can also kind of have a soul, or is that something different?
Well, as I mentioned before, anytime you have two or more people working together, because we have ancestral communal souls, we have a natural tendency to come together and begin to create these communal souls.
Interesting, yeah.
If you realize this, if you know this, then when you come into a company as a consultant, it's perfectly clear that there is this communal identity that both includes all of the employees and managers, everything, and is also separate from them. And if you can engage that and communicate with it and work with it, then you can bring about changes and remove obstacles and open up entanglements and all this in ways that are just not accessible by ordinary means. So that's what I like to do is come in as a consultant and either come into the company and do direct kind of interventions, or in some cases provide like a retreat setting where they can come and spend a whole weekend, and we can work on developing a conscious, intentional sense of communal awareness, so they can actually wake up in this and put it to use for them. But more often than not, my work is troubleshooting companies that have run into problems one way or another, often because they're not following certain natural laws. Okay, for instance, there was a company that I worked with some years ago where they had been taken over by a big corporation. They had been a family company for a long time. At least, I think it was like 2 generations or so. And they thought, well, this is a very successful company. We're just going to come in, take it over, and we'll continue to be successful. They came in, and within a matter of months, they started losing their employees. The people who worked for the old company started leaving. They couldn't understand why. So when I came in, I was completely clueless. I had no idea what was going on. So I said, okay, so when you bought this company, what did you do? I said, well, we really liked how it was going, but, well, we redecorated. Okay. And it felt like there was something there, you know. So, well, how did you redecorate? He says, oh, well, this stuff, it looked like it was the 70s. You know, They had a, I said, okay. Well, what did you change? And it came down to they had this big portrait of the founder that was in the main office. And everybody walked by. It was like the waiting room. Everybody walked by it every day. Well, they took that down and put in this wall fountain, right? And immediately I realized at a soul level, the whole company felt that was a betrayal.
Yeah.
So I said, so where is that portrait? It was downstairs in the basement behind a bunch of other stuff. They pulled it back out, cleaned it up, gave it a new frame, put it back on the wall. Within a matter of a week, things were turning around.
Huh. It's interesting. Okay. Something so small as that can make such a huge impact.
Yeah. But a lot of that is, I mean, it's a very phenomenological process, okay? I'm not really all that concerned with theories about why it works because we can't know.
It just does.
But we can't observe the phenomena. Right. We can say, when we do this, this happens. So I'm going to do this. Right? So we can observe, for instance, that there are orders of precedence. For instance, in a family, the parents are bigger, in a way, than the children. And when children acknowledge that, and the parents acknowledge it, everything goes well. When the child says, no, I'm the big one, I don't trust you, I'm going to parent you, well, the child winds up not feeling any sense of belonging, having major identity issues throughout their entire life. And the only way to get them back to that is to, at a soul level, have them come into the ancestral soul, stand in front of their parents, and recognize them, acknowledge, you're the big ones, I'm the little one. You're the parents, and I'm the child. Okay. So a similar thing happens in businesses where the founder is the parent. And if that founder isn't being acknowledged and honored, you don't have to like him or her, but you have to honor that they came first. And when the founders, when that order of precedence is honored, everything just goes better.
Makes sense, yeah, definitely. I could see that in my own experiences in the military, definitely, where people don't honor their the people in charge or the people from the history of that. And it's often taught, military history is a big part of learning, becoming part of the military. You learn history, and maybe there's something to that. There obviously is. That's why they do it. But,
if you don't follow chain of command, things don't go well.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, it's been a great talk with you today, and glad that you were on our show and could talk to us about shamanism. And for me, this has been
a pleasure.
For me, this has been a big, important aspect of my life to understand it. For one reason or another, I've definitely been very interested in shamanism for over 10 years now. So you've cleared up a lot of my personal questions that I've had, and I will definitely go out and get at least one of your books to start going through the guide works and see about getting to the next one after that. I think there's a lot of good information just from talking to you that's going to be in there. So people can go to your website, what is Shaman's Touch, correct? Is that right?
Yes,
.com?
www.shamanstouch.com.
Yeah, I say it wrong every time, so.
No worries.
But,
I'm not sure there's a right and wrong way. It's just whatever you're used to.
Yeah, people screw it up, and I'm definitely one of those people. So, but yeah, and also they can go to your website and buy a number of your books, and then your publisher is Moon Books, I believe.
Yes.
Yes, and
Moon
they
Books
can go
out of
there.
the United Kingdom. Yeah.
Okay.
And of course, it's available on Amazon.com. That's probably the best way to get a hold of the books.
Okay, great. Yeah, just like everything else, right?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Matt and Lee, I really appreciate it. It's been a great time.
Yeah, pleasure talking with you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Cosmic Echo, a Taylor podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Kenn and his work, you can visit our website at tailleaders.com/CE podcast, and there you can click on links that will take you to his work as well as his books. Additionally, if you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so through our Patreon page, which is located at the same site. We look forward to bringing you additional episodes in the near future, but until then, happy dreaming.